Just to help us kind of benchmark where we are on FCPA enforcement, the pause is done now. So we now have FCPA enforcement is now back, but now it's sort of in a more tailored areas of enforcement. The areas of enforcement really fall into three buckets, which are activities associated with cartels and transnational criminal organizations, money laundering and shell companies engaging in money laundering for cartels and transnational criminal organizations, and foreign officials receiving bribes from cartels or transnational organizations. None of this was new because, like Mike said, there were previews. We had a memo in February. We had an executive order, really. So a lot of this we had sort of been already seeing coming, that this sort of focus on transnational organizations. There are other areas as well that the memo highlights might be focus areas for enforcement. I think for people listening and people thinking about this, this is where you think about, do I have risk? Do I have exposure here? Not a lot of my corporate clients have dealings with cartels and transnational criminal organizations. It doesn't come up that often in corporate compliance. But the next bucket, I think, might resonate a little more because it's cases that impact U.S. interests and national security. And that's a theme around everything that's happening in enforcement. Like, they're saying, how do we use enforcement to protect U.S. citizens and U.S. companies and U.S. interests? So here they're really saying, are there cases where you hurt another U.S. company? So think when you're going head to head in a bid tender process against a U.S. company, that's a pressure point. They're also really focused on corruption and bribery around critical infrastructure and key assets. So defense industry, intel, mining, critical minerals, deep water ports. If that's your world, think about like the perfect storm here. Well, the perfect storm here would be critical infrastructure, fighting against a U.S. company, and somehow a cartel is involved. But let's just say at least the first two. That's an area I think that continues to be an enforcement risk area. I don't know if you're thinking about, I know there's one more slide on this, Mike, but if you want to layer in a sort of substantively, this is still somewhat broad, but not the full, you don't see the traditional healthcare types of bribery and corruption. You don't see sort of the ticky-tack types of stuff that we've seen in the past.
No, I think that's right. And I think, look, an argument could be made. That's probably a good thing. I think as defense lawyers, right, we always would say to, the prosecuting units, the FCPA unit, you're overreaching here. And so maybe this is a way of kind of course correcting. It's just so dramatic that I think that's one of the issues. Now, again, you've alluded to it here. These proclamations from the department, from the White House, have really been to protect U.S. So if you're sitting in my shoes as a multinational company, you're not taking a lot of comfort in these kinds of proclamations. We're as exposed, I think multinational companies, non-domiciled in the U.S., could be as exposed under the FCPA as we've always been. Look, the biggest FCPA settlements we know are against foreign companies, not U.S.-based companies. So, again, it's going to be a little interesting to see what actually comes about as they start to investigate these things, realizing they're doing it with a much smaller unit than they used to have also, because they've reassigned so many prosecutors from the FCPA unit. So even if there are FCPA cases to be brought, there's a smaller pool of prosecutors to bring them. And as everyone on this call, I expect, knows, most of the FCPA cases came out of Main Justice, working very often with local U.S. attorneys' offices. But the reason that the Main Justice worked with local U.S. attorneys' offices, most weren't familiar enough or had the resources to go after FCPA cases alone. The other issue related to this, though, also is, I think this is in some ways a bit historic, which is far more of enforcement now is being centralized out of Main Justice and the White House than has ever been the case. U.S. attorneys' offices now are not as necessarily independent as historically they had been. And I think that's going to be another thing to examine. So in other words, can the Eastern District of New York, can the Southern District of California independently bring an FCPA case? And I think the answer is no, because I think part of the proclamation was it's got to go through Main Justice. So that's where we stand right now. But I think if you're an international company, you still need to be pretty careful about this.
Yeah. And I think I saw a recent case recently where it was at the pleading stages, like the defendant said, but I'm a U.S. company, so you shouldn't go after me. And I think they made it very clear, we don't really care who you are. It's who are you hurting? So I think I agree and with you that if you're a foreign company, you're kind of in a higher risk area. But even
Yeah.
US companies, I don't think want to get too comfortable, because if you're competing with other US companies, particularly in these high risk areas, I think
Right.
you're still in the crosshairs.
And look, there are two absolutes also. The FCPA has not been repealed. And the other absolute is administrations are 4 years and statute of limitations are at least 5, and in many cases with the FCPA, 8 years. So if you're a company and you're thinking you got a free ride, even as we sit here today, to engage in wrongful conduct under the FCPA, that statute of limitations is going to survive through the next administration if there's a shift in party administration. So I just think that companies, I understand why they think they have a little bit more running room now than they might otherwise have had. I would really caution against that.
And if it makes anybody feel better, I would say all of my clients are taking your approach, Mike, and saying, like, this doesn't change really what we're
It
doing.
really shouldn't.
And I think they see that long game, but I think they also see all of the other reasons why it shouldn't, which is our values we don't want to do it. That's not how we want to do business. I think reputation really resonates with people on this. Like, I can't go out and sell my life-saving medical devices or this really high stakes product if people don't trust me. And so I think that reputation is so important.
You're right. And you're raising a really good point, too, because we think about it, about enforcement in regulatory agencies, the DOJ, the SEC, and all of that. But there are a ton of other external stakeholders that I now have visibility into since I'm in-house. You've got banks, you've got investor groups, you've got insurance carriers, you've got rating agencies. And, one of the things that's part of my job is I make regular presentations to all those other external stakeholders. And I can tell you, since January of 2025, they've not changed the course of their questions with wanting to know, do we have a robust compliance program? What are our internal controls? Are you training the appropriate people? Are you doing it on the global scale? So all those other external stakeholders have shown no less an interest in making sure we're doing things the right way.
Totally. Even on the transactional side, when you're doing an IPO, if you're trying to do a fundraise, like, the same diligence questions are going to come across because the banks care, the lenders care. So I think what we're seeing is that companies are continuing to march forward on this. But it does impact, I think, how you think about some other things that we'll get to, including how you engage with the government, right? Or how you might deal with an issue when it comes forward. The last thing, and I'll pull these slides down so we can move on, is DOJ says we're only going to focus on substantial bribery. So they don't care about sort of the de minimis low dollar stuff. They're really focused on substantial bribery. In my experience, that's not a big change, right? You don't see a lot of cases where it was like the $50 bribe to get to the front of the line. Like, they had limited resources before, but I think this can make you feel better about making a decision on, I'm not going to disclose some ticky-tack thing to the government because they've already said that's not the kind of thing that they're interested in.
I think you're exactly right. And I think I said it before, and I'll say it again, because I think it is part of the challenge we all face. There is a political atmosphere now that is invading traditional law enforcement and regulatory enforcement because there's just so much noise out there. But when you actually look at what's being done, there aren't necessarily as big a transitions as I think the general public would think there is, if that makes sense. Because, again, go read the policies. They're sensible. They're practical. They could have been written by any deputy attorney general over the past 30 years. The other thing also, I think, I just want to add this with the FCPA, is that while the U.S. enforcement may be less, the international enforcement may still be there. Most countries now have laws on the books prohibiting bribery, prohibiting corruption. And, several months ago, France, the UK, and Switzerland formed the International Anti-Corruption Prosecutorial Task Force. So there are going to be other enforcement agencies out there, particularly if you're a multinational company. So while you may think you're safe in the United States, and perhaps you may be for a period of time, you still have all this other exposure around the globe.
And I think that's relevant, too, to the prosecution guidelines, where they say if there's enforcement risk outside the U.S. and there's interest by PNF, by SFO, they might not pick it up in the U.S. But that means it's getting picked up maybe by the SFO, PNF, CGU,
That's
whatever.
exactly right.
So I do think that's something to consider. But I think about that as sort of like, that's a tool in my defense lawyer toolkit, which is if I can argue there's a better enforcement agency, they might be more receptive to that. They also talk about that prosecutors should be thinking about collateral consequences. And I've never heard that before. Like
Yeah.
during the investigation, how disruptive is going to be. Again, that's just an argument that you could make to say, look, this is going to cost me this much money and put these people out of job and be so disruptive and impact security. Like they might hear that now. Yeah. I think we said it before.
And there might be a receptiveness. That's the exact point, right? I always made that argument. For 24 years, I made that argument, and it very rarely succeeded. But now, because of the policy and priority changes, there might be more receptiveness to it at this point.